We have, to start off our first session of this edition of the Tata Steel Bhubaneswar Literary Meet, our session is called The Mahatma and Netaji, where Sugata Bose examines the relationship between two of India's tallest icons. Sugata Bose will be in conversation with Jatindra Nayak. A short introduction to both of our speakers. Dr. Sugata Bose is the Gardner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs at Harvard University. He is the author of the definitive biography, His Majesty's Opponent, Subhash Chandra Bose and India's Struggles Against Empire. He is currently also a Member of Parliament. Dr. Jatindra Nayak is a translator, literary critic, columnist, editor, and educationist. A much awarded translator and author, he is the founder of Rupantar, which is devoted to the cause of translation. He also teaches English to students of Utkal University. Welcome, sir. Welcome, sir. I shall now hand over to our two stalwarts.
So I must begin by saying what an absolute pleasure and honor to engage Professor Sugata Bose in a conversation. He was here 3 years ago, 2016, at the Tata Literary Meet, and I had talked to him about his book, His Majesty's Opponent, the definitive biography that Mrs. Banerjee just mentioned. So it's a great pleasure to have him here again. And today we are talking about a very interesting subject, that subject which exercises everyone's mind in the 150th year of Mahatma Gandhi's birth, Netaji and Mahatma. And before I ask a question to Professor Bose, I would like to tell students here that Professor Bose has a soft corner for students, college and university students, because the book which he has just published, Nation as Mother, has been dedicated to students who value freedom. And I may mention again here that in the Parliament he has been defending students who have been branded anti-national, their right to express their views, their right to challenge assumptions that are dominant or with which they don't agree. So at least for students here, Professor Bose is a highly inspiring figure, and this discussion may benefit students if you are there, because he has a soft corner for them, and he imagines them as the future of our nation, and a particular kind of nationalism which is now threatening the very fabric of our nation. He is contesting very eloquently. So Professor Bose, we have all been talking about Mahatma Gandhi's legacy in his 150th year, and it seems that this legacy is insecure, with people challenging different aspects of it, like students in Ghana refusing to accept a statue of Mahatma Gandhi in their university. And Gandhi had always his adversaries, Ambedkar being one, Dr. Ambedkar being one, and of course his relationship with Netaji was conflicted. So in the 150th year of Mahatma Gandhi's birth, how do we look? What new light can we throw on the very conflicted relationship between Gandhi and Netaji?
First of all, Jatin, thank you for the warm introduction. And let me say at the outset how delighted I am to be back in Odisha. Both my grandfather, Sharat Chandra Bose, and my granduncle, Netaji, were born in Odisha. And so I consider myself half Oriya, and Kotok, Bhubaneswar, Puri are homes to me. So I'm really happy to be back here. I think Mahatma Gandhi would have to have a critical appreciation of his legacy. We don't need to protect our great leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose from legitimate criticism. You mentioned the incident in Ghana where students objected to Gandhiji's statue. Now, there was a time when Mahatma Gandhi wrote in a language that today would be considered somewhat offensive to Africa and Africans. But I think Nelson Mandela had the right attitude on that question. He forgave the Mahatma for those comments, saying that these were made before Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi had been transformed into the Mahatma. And we have to recognize that Mahatma Gandhi changed over time. There was a constant evolution in his life. Let me just mention one aspect of that change. I think he learned from his rebellious son, Subhash Chandra Bose, the value of cultural intimacy among India's different religious communities and linguistic groups. Even in the early 1920s, Gandhiji would not dine together with his closest Muslim political comrades, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali. At that stage, he was not in favor of interfaith marriages. But then he witnessed and he learned what Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had achieved in the Azad Hind movement. And so when he went to see INA prisoners in the Kabul lines and then in the Red Fort, he heard from them how they had transcended differences of creed and religion, how they used to dine together in common messes. And here they complained, the British are serving us separately, Hindu tea and Muslim tea. Mahatma Gandhi asked, why do you suffer it? And they replied, we don't. We mix Hindu tea and Muslim tea half and half and then serve. And Mahatma Gandhi appreciated that very much. And as I have written in an essay in my new book, The Nation as Mother, on Mahatma Gandhi's last stand, it's an essay titled Unity or Partition, when he was asked in Noakhali in 1946 what his views were on interreligious marriages. He was then supporting intercaste marriages. He said that I honestly have to tell you that I had not been in favor of interfaith marriages before, but now I have changed my mind and I support these interfaith marriages. So here was a man who evolved with the times, who was prepared to rectify earlier mistakes. And that, I think, is one aspect of the greatness of Mahatma Gandhi.
In the 150th year of Gandhi's birth, one major event has taken place, at least as far as students of Indian freedom struggle are concerned. That is the publication of the 1,000-page biography of Gandhi by Ramaguha. And you have devoted a whole chapter in Nation as Mother to Ramaguha's India after Gandhi. And I think you admire at the same time, criticize some aspects of. So I'm sure you must have had a look at this book and the way it discusses, describes, explores Gandhi's conflicted relationship with Netaji. So would you like to dwell on it for a couple of minutes?
Well, you are absolutely right that I both admire and criticize my friend Ram Guha's works. I had written a review in the Indian Express of one of his books, India After Gandhi, and it was a classic split review. And I did not entirely agree with his differentiation of constitutional democracy in the first 30 years after independence and his critique of a more populist democracy in more recent decades. I had pointed out that there were limitations to our democracy even in the Nehruvian period, which he tended to ignore. And I think it's important to recognize that in the early years after independence, we had something of an oligarchical democracy. in some ways there has been a deepening of democracy over the decades. And also we cannot forget that it is in the Nehruvian period that the legitimate rights of people in the northeast, such as Nagaland and even of Kashmir, had been trampled upon. So those were my criticisms of Ram Guha. I haven't read his 1,000-page biography of Gandhi, his second volume, not every word of it, but let me give you my take on what you describe as the conflicted Mahatma-Netaji relationship. My view is that in Bengal in particular, the differences that emerged, the split of 1939 has been hugely exaggerated. We have to recognize that Subhash Chandra Bose participated in the Indian freedom struggle for nearly 20 years under Mahatma Gandhi's leadership. He resigned from the Indian Civil Service, came back to Bombay, and the day he arrived, he went to see Gandhiji at Mani Bhavan and bombarded him with questions. He was not entirely satisfied by Gandhiji's answer as to how he was going to deliver Swaraj within a year, but nevertheless, he took part in the non-violent non-cooperation movement, and he always accepted that Mahatma Gandhi had roused the Indian masses in 1919, 1920. He had offered to the Indian people a new weapon of struggle. Now, for a variety of reasons, there were differences in 1939. Subhash Chandra Bose defeated Mahatma Gandhi's favored candidate in a contested election for the Congress presidency. Subhash Chandra Bose wanted a more radical anti-colonial movement. He wanted to plan for socialism in the future. He did not like the potential for compromise on the federation with Indian princes being offered by the British. But then I believe that between 1942 and 1945, Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose came closer in their aims and ideology. As Maulana Azad has written in his book, India Wins Freedom, Gandhiji was very admiring of Netaji's ability to escape from India to raise an army of liberation abroad, and his view of the Second World War was colored by that admiration, as Azad put it. He told Louis Fisher in 1942 that Netaji was a patriot of patriots, and the compliment was returned by Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. He made a beautiful broadcast to Gandhiji on his birthday, 2nd October 1943, from Singapore. And then, of course, on July 6th, 1944, there came the address to the Mahatma from Rangoon, where he, for the first time, addressed Gandhiji as the father of our nation. His voice quivered, S.A. Iyer has written. He became full of emotion as he delivered the final sentence. And he said, "Father of our nation, in this holy war, we ask for your blessings and good wishes." And I can say that in order to write my essay on Gandhiji between 1945 and 1948, I read every line that Gandhiji had written or spoken in that period. And every reference to Netaji is a eulogy. And even 7 days before his own tragic assassination on 23rd January 1948, he remembered Netaji's birthday and said that no other leader had been able to evoke such affection and loyalty from all Indians, regardless of religion and language, as Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had. So I think we need, first of all, to recognize the mutual affection and admiration between these two great leaders. And I'll go further to say that in these troubled times, as Ajanta Mahapatra told us, we need to draw on the legacy of both Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose.
After you delivered a stirring lecture in Ravenshaw University a year or so ago, I remember a young student asking you a very interesting question, and your answer was a beautiful one, and I would like you to repeat that. He asked you, what would have happened had Subhash Chandra Bose come alive to India and met Mahatma Gandhi after independence? It was such a stirring answer that I would like, if you remember, I think, that what if Mahatma Gandhi would have met Subhash Bose after 1947 and had Subhash Bose escaped that accident and remained alive?
To be honest, I don't remember the answer that I gave at the end of the Bibudhendra Mishra memorial lecture, but I can certainly try to respond to that same question which you have put to me again today. I think that in the final years of his life, particularly in 1946-47, Mahatma Gandhi missed his rebellious son. His more obedient sons, Vallabhbhai Patel and Jawaharlal Nehru, were elbowing him aside. And at that stage, Mahatma Gandhi was very alone. Gandhiji was needed by the Congress party as long as there had to be another mass movement to force the British to quit India. But after the Red Fort trials of the three INA officers, Shahnawaz, Dhillon and Saigal, it became clear by early 1946 that the British would have to quit India. And at that point the question was, how would power be shared once the British left India? And I think both Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose would have done their utmost to find an equitable power-sharing arrangement among the different religious communities and linguistic groups of India. Mahatma Gandhi tried to avert the partition, but did not succeed. Had Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose survived, and had he been able to come back to India, I believe that he would have strengthened Mahatma Gandhi's hands. And I think that the two working together, the saint and the warrior, would have been able to prevent the tragic partition of the country along religious lines.
You made this very interesting point in His Majesty's opponent when you talked about the legacy of Subhash Bose, that Subhash Bose, Gandhi enabled the masses to enter the freedom struggle, but Subhash Chandra Bose weakened the most powerful pillar of British rule in India, namely the army. So the British found it increasingly difficult to rule India through their army after the INA. And the other thing that I would like you to elaborate on a bit is the difference between, in some ways you argue that Netaji was closer to Gandhi on certain questions like secularism, on Hindu-Muslim unity, on bureaucracy, for instance. That you called it the marriage of convenience with the bureaucracy, Congress party's marriage of convenience with bureaucracy. So some of these things bring Netaji closer to Gandhi. The question of secularism and the question of bureaucracy. But in one respect, Gandhi was very different from Netaji, because for Netaji, the eschewal of violence was a strategic necessity, whereas Gandhi's belief in non-violence was far more fundamental or far more visceral. So there are two different questions, but I hope you would like to reflect on that.
Netaji understood that in 1919-1920, it was not possible to launch an armed struggle against the British which had any chance of success. And that is why he was prepared to accept Mahatma Gandhi's strategy of non-violent non-cooperation and then later civil disobedience as a strategic necessity. There seemed to be no point in taking the fight onto a ground where the British were strong and where the Indians were weak. But having spent 2 decades taking part in Gandhi-led non-violent mass movements, he recognized that the civilian masses had all rallied to the call of Mahatma Gandhi. But the British had been very successful in their astute attempts to keep the Indian soldiers insulated from the swirling currents of civilian political discontent. Soldiers recruited from groups which the British called martial races and castes were still operating as an imperial fire brigade. Their loyalty was to the British King Emperor. And that is why when an international war crisis broke out in 1939, Netaji felt that this was a golden opportunity to have access to these Indian soldiers. And he took the controversial decision to go to the countries which were enemies of Britain, despite his ideological differences with them, so that he could change the loyalty of Indian soldiers to the British King Emperor to a new loyalty for the Indian nation. And in that, I think he succeeded marvelously. But he not only changed the loyalty of Indian soldiers. Of course, there were those like Shahnawaz Khan who said that when he heard Netaji's speeches in Singapore, he was almost hypnotized. He enabled him to see India through the eyes of an Indian. Earlier on, he had only been interested in soldiering and sport, as he put it at the Red Fort trial. But Netaji did not accept the British stereotypes of martial races and castes. And that is why he also recruited civilians, most of whom happened to be from South India in Southeast Asia. And he brought them into the Indian National Army. He united Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians. He linked North and South. And that is why, I found last month in December, I went to Punjab. I spoke in Jalandhar on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Azad Hind movement. I then went to Kerala. And at the Kerala History Congress, I gave a memorial lecture named after a man called Abdul Qadir, an INA soldier who had been executed by the British in September of 1943. And I saw that in North and South India alike, and of course in East and West too, Netaji is still revered. And I must say that Mahatma Gandhi recognized Netaji's achievement. He said in his writings in the Harijan, which he revived in February of 1946, and also in his various statements, that Netaji had instilled a new ideal and a new vision in the Indian soldier. And I'll just add one little point. Netaji had greatly admired Mahatma Gandhi's essay in Young India, for which he was charged with sedition and sent to prison in 1922. And what had he said in that particular essay in Young India? Mahatma Gandhi, who had recruited soldiers for the British during the First World War, had changed his mind and said that the Indian soldier was now being used as a hired assassin. That's not my phrase, it was Gandhiji's phrase, and therefore he recognized Netaji's accomplishment in the Second World War, enabling the Indian soldier to have a new ideal and a new vision. He actually built a truly national army.
I forget whether you have quoted that obituary of Gandhi or Ram Guha, where Gandhi quotes Tulsidas. He says, "All comes to the brave."
In fact, I have quoted it in my essay on Gandhiji in the
all
Nation as
brave.
Mother. Tulsidas, that
Yes.
everything becomes right for the brave.
Brave, yes. All becomes right for the brave. I'll change the direction of my questions for a change. I'm struck by when you write about, Netaji's lecture, the presidential lecture he gives at the Haripura Congress. I think he was unique in emphasizing the need for birth control. Perhaps he was the only leader who in 1938 was talking about the need for population control or the policy of population control. And in some ways, Gandhi was also interested in these things through the practice of brahmacharya and all that in a very different way. But don't you think that is a great visionary, Netaji, in thinking about population control in way back in 1938, when our population hardly exceeded 300 millions or something like that?
Netaji was not just a warrior hero. After all, he had read philosophy in college and university. He was a far-sighted statesman, and his address as Congress president at Haripura in Gujarat is really more about India's future rather than the immediate struggle against the British Raj. He was really thinking about plans for the social and economic reconstruction of India once freedom was won. And you're absolutely right that he was probably the first to highlight the population problem in India, and he wanted to devise a policy on demography. But there was a whole range of issues on which he spoke. He was, in fact, devoting some part of his address to the problems of agricultural debt. After all, this was towards the end of the Depression decade, and he was talking about the problems faced by the peasantry. Some of these problems have returned to haunt the Indian peasantry. And that is why I would urge the young students who are present here to read Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, because when you see his visage in his military uniform, he looks resplendent, but that's not the only aspect of Netaji. He was a many-splendored personality, and a photograph that I like best, which I printed in my book, His Majesty's Opponent, where he's sitting thoughtfully like this, resting his chin on his hand. He's reflective, he's thoughtful, and after all, we have published his collected works in 12 volumes from the Netaji Research Bureau. And I might add, since this is a literary meet, his letters have an effervescent literary quality, both in English and in Bangla. Interestingly, he wrote to his elder brother, Mejdada Sharat Chandra Bose, in English, but he wrote to his sister-in-law, Bibhavati, and also Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das's widow, Bashanti Devi, in Bangla. And so Subhash Chandra Bose needs to be read in terms of his literature, in terms of his political philosophy, in addition to analyzing what in fact was his major contribution in speeding up the process of Indian independence, which we have already talked about, destroying that prized instrument of British colonial rule, and that was the British Indian Army.
Whenever we talk about Netaji, I think one question continues to haunt us. It remains persistent. That is his support for the fascist powers. And you have talked at length about this question, and you have given very interesting answers to them. But for the benefit of this audience, particularly the young, I would like to rehearse that analysis here, because that question remains a troubling one. What would have Netaji become had he succeeded in his effort? Would he have emerged as a dictator? Would he have imposed dictatorship for a while on India? Because he was a leader in a hurry, because he wanted to industrialize India. He disagreed with Gandhi on the utopian village communities as an answer to our persistent economic ills.
Subhash Chandra Bose spent 3 years in European exile between 1933 and 1936. And during those years, he was able to observe both German Nazism and Italian fascism quite closely. And as he was returning to India in March 1936, he wrote in a letter to a German scholar that he found the new German nationalism to be narrow, selfish, and arrogant. And while he was in Europe, he made very strong protests against Hitler statements and also Nazi racism. When Japan invaded mainland China in 1937, all of his sympathies were with China. He wrote a long essay in the Modern Review titled Japan's Role in the Far East, where he said that China would rise phoenix-like from the ashes. And he urged India not to follow the path of imperialism and self-aggrandizement. So here was a man who understood that nationalism could be a truly Janus-facet phenomenon, that it could have a liberating aspect, but it could also have a very oppressive aspect. And he did not favor narrow nationalism. Now, there are occasional references, at least in 3 different essays or speeches of his, where he says that it may be necessary to have a strong central government for the first 10 or 20 years. But that does not in any way make him an authoritarian. In the address that he made to Mahatma Gandhi, which I mentioned in July of 1944, he said that the provisional government of Azad Hind that he had established was only for the purpose of winning India's independence. As soon as freedom was achieved, the Indian people will decide what form of government they would like and also who would run that government. And he was absolutely clear about that. He had told Mahatma Gandhi that he would like to come and see him, later on, and Gandhi had accepted that idea when they met for the last time. And there's a beautiful last letter of Gandhiji to Subhash Chandra Bose just before his escape, in which he says, "You are irrepressible whether ill or well. Do get well before going in for fireworks." That was just less than 3 weeks before Netaji's Mahanishkraman, or the Great Escape from India. I think that Subhash Chandra Bose was committed to democracy. As he put it, democracy is not a Western institution, it is a human institution. He thought that there never was an ideal village community in India's past. That was in Mahatma Gandhi's imagination. He did want a modern industrial future for India, but he also believed in another essential component of democracy, and that was federalism. In that same striking lecture that he gave in Pune as president of the Maharashtra Political Conference in 1928, where he said that he favored cultural intimacy between India's different communities, he also said that he envisioned free India to be a federal India. And in this day and age, we really need to recognize that there can be no true and genuine democracy in a country as diverse as India without federalism being an essential element defining it.
Recent book you have talked about something so resonant as anti-nationalism. You talk about nationalism and anti-nationalism. And you also talk about the dangers to nationalism which are being posed by the troubled times that we just talked about. So in the and of course your reference point here is Rabindranath Tagore's essay on nationalism, his essay on the dangers of nationalism. So in the 150th year of Gandhi's birth, can we talk about the similarities between Netaji's inclusive vision of nationalism and Gandhi's vision of nationalism, and also distinguish it from the Nehruvian nationalism that you, I think, are quite critical of in some parts of your book?
Yes. Now, Rabindranath Tagore, published his little book Nationalism based on his lectures in Japan and the United States in 1916. The book came out a year later, in 1917, and he was quite critical of the mechanical form that the nation state had taken, particularly in the West, and he feared that Japan was imitating the West. He did not want Indian patriots to imitate what he saw as the monstrous features of European and Western nationalism. But Tagore himself was a patriot. He loved his homeland. He wrote beautiful patriotic songs, poetry. So here was someone who could love his own land, but who could be critical of the modern ideology of nationalism and also the rigid territorial form of the nation state. So practically all of our great leaders of the freedom struggle had, different alternative versions of nationalism, recognizing both the positive and negative elements within it. What is very interesting is that when Mahatma Gandhi made an obituary comment after Rabindranath Tagore's death in August of 1941, he described Rabindranath Tagore as a great nationalist, despite Tagore being a critic of nationalism. And one can understand that, because what Gandhi meant was this was a man, a great poet, who loved his homeland. Now, what I would say about the difficult question that you have posed in terms of the nationalisms or the inclusive versions of nationalism which Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose subscribed to is this: that in the name of secular nationalism, Nehru, in fact, could be very impatient of differences. He wanted one loyalty of the citizen to the would-be nation state. But Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose respected expressions of differences. They would not want a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh or a Christian to give up their religious faith or identity. They would be respectful of all of that. They would not want an Oriya or a Tamil to give up their pride in their own linguistic or cultural identity. And so, Gandhi's follower, Potti Sri Ramalu later on fasted to death, asking for a Telugu-speaking state of Andhra. So the attitude that Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had was that we need to respect differences in order to rise above them, to forge an overarching Indian unity. And Rabindranath Tagore was no different, actually. If you read his essay Bharatbarsha, he said that where there is genuine difference, it is only by respecting that difference and then restraining it in its proper place that it is possible to achieve unity. You cannot achieve unity by issuing legal fiats that everybody is one. And I fear that Nehru, in the name of secularism, sometimes issued legal fiats that everybody must be one. And that attitude, if secularism fails, or when socialism fails, it opens the way for what we see today in India, which is religious majoritarian nationalism. But if we follow Mahatma Gandhi, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and even Rabindranath Tagore, then we will be respecting differences in order to transcend them. And I think that is the way in which we can craft a stronger and longer lasting Indian Union. You cannot impose unity artificially from above. It has to be organic. It has to come from below. And I think that Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose show us the way on how to achieve precisely that goal.
Before I ask you to take a few questions, because after such a performance we can't not have questions, so I'm sure questions are stirring in the minds of the audience. Being a very distinguished historian, I can't resist the temptation of asking this question at this particular juncture, that the past is never past. The past has become a battlefield in contemporary times. And history is being used as a weapon, as an instrument of supporting this or opposing this, oppressing people or liberating them. So what, as a historian, as a very distinguished historian, is your take on the place of the past in the contemporary scheme of things and how it's being used or abused?
At the moment, many politicians are in fact abusing history, and I think what we should always guard against is the instrumental uses of history for purposes of the present. But I think the only way that we can combat the abuses that are taking place of history is to delve even more deeply into history and actually understand that history can be a matter of interpretation, but it is never a matter of just opinion or manufacturing of facts in the past.
A few questions from the audience. Make sure that they're very brief and pointed and not comments or opinions.
Hello? Hello. I am A.K. Mukherjee. Now, my only question to Mr. Bose is that, did Gandhiji know that Subhash was dead or alive? And if he knew, why didn't he say?
Mahatma Gandhi did say, Mahatma Gandhi did express his view on the question of Netaji's mortal end. At first, Mahatma Gandhi had hoped very much that Netaji was alive and that he would come back and be part of the final battle for freedom alongside him. And as he put it, that it was very hard for him to believe that Netaji could leave us before realizing the dream of Swaraj. Now, this was his position in late 1945 and very early 1946, before the facts of what had happened on the 18th of August 1945 were clear in India. But then, on the 30th of March 1946, Mahatma Gandhi wrote a very moving article in his journal Harijan, and it came out a couple of days later at the beginning of April. And there he said very clearly that what I had said before about Netaji, knowing that he had escaped in the past, he had hoodwinked his enemies before, all that was based on unsupported feeling. That was the phrase that Gandhiji used. But now there is evidence before me. And that is why I am prepared to set aside unsupported feeling, rely on the evidence. And so he said to his readers and to his audience that you must forget what I had said before. We just have to come to terms with this tragedy that Netaji has, left us. And he said that, human beings' ingenuity is really nothing before the power of the one God. And so it's a very beautiful essay, and I would urge, the younger generation to read that essay in the Harijan. Even today, there is a battle that goes on in the minds of people between unsupported feeling on the one hand and evidence on the other. We really must go beyond the meaningless controversy over Netaji's death. We must focus on his life and work, because the younger generation of Indians have still a lot to learn from Netaji's book of life.
Sir, your expression, religiously majoritarian nationalism, I humbly feel betrays a small intellectual hatred for the current trend in the world. If you look at America, it is nationalism. If you look at China,
Please
they are
ask
that
a
is-
question.
Sir, the question is that nationalism. In India also, it is nationalism. So that nation first or the nation state theory that we are talking of, which apparently contradicts with unity in diversity. But today's trend is different. In view of that, let us tolerate that religious majoritarian democracy that we witness today, because it goes for nation first. As it happens in China, as it happens in America, it should happen also in India.
I agree with you that, there is a version of nationalism that you see in many parts of the world today. And Donald Trump in the United States of America, where I happen to teach, is a votary of race-based nationalism. He believes in white nationalism, and he's giving a lot of support to white supremacy in the United States of America. But that also comes from a feeling of insecurity. They feel that there are, people of color, including the African Americans, who are beginning to fight for and even gain equality. So it is a kind of a reaction to the assertion of those who had been discriminated against in the past. And here too, there is nationalism which is based on religious majoritarianism. And I will only say that I disapprove of and am critical of this version of nationalism, which I have said in Parliament too, I find narrow, selfish, and arrogant. I believe in the more generous and imaginative and inclusive nationalism taught to us by our great leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. And when you draw the easy link between religious majoritarianism-based nationalism and democracy, there too I respectfully disagree with you. What is democracy? Democracy is a political value and a system where a majority needs to be earned. Now, if a majority is already delivered or claimed on a prefabricated ethnic, race-based or religious platter, that undermines democracy. If even before you are able to choose, you can claim on the basis of your race or religion that we are the majority, then there is a problem. Let us have a genuine democracy where majorities have to be earned by presenting policies and programs before the people of the country.
Good evening, sir.
This is the last question.
Sir, when you have told us that Subhash Bose was to some extent groomed in Orissa also, during his tenure of political movement and freedom movement, who are the people in Orissa who has inspired him to go ahead?
He, grew up in Orissa, and he has written in his autobiography, An Indian Pilgrim, that his home was in the Oriya Bazar area in Kotok, where he had many Muslim neighbors. And he said that there was never any conflict between Hindus and Muslims, or, as he put it, Bengalis and Oriyas in that particular context. And he was always inspired by what he saw in his childhood in trying to keep good relations between linguistic groups and religious communities of India. Of course, he went to Ravenshaw Collegiate School. Beni Madhav Das had a deep influence on him. But I also will mention that there are beautiful letters that he wrote from Mandalay jail in the mid-1920s to a great Oriya figure. This was Gopabandhu Das. And it has been my great privilege to come to Orissa to give lectures named after these, great figures of this state. Jatin mentioned I gave the Bibhudendra Mishra Memorial Lecture in Ravenshaw College, Ravenshaw University now last year. But before that, a few years ago, I was here to give the Gopabandhu Das Memorial Lecture. So he had very close ties with many important literary and political figures of Orissa. And certainly, my grandfather, Sharad Bose, practically brought Hare Krishna Mahatab into politics, with whom he served in the interim government. So I think I would want to conclude by saying that Netaji's roots in Orissa were formative in his mental outlook and the kind of generous and broad-minded politics that he practiced throughout his life.
To Professor Bose for sharing your thoughts with us and for inspiring us with your vision, inclusive vision of nationalism and nation. And I hope we'll have many more such occasions where we'll be able to listen to you, who consider yourself half an Odia. We'll become a fully an Odia, I think, after 10 visits.
Thank you very much.